Ahead on Straight Talk.
People are now voting with their feet.
Once known as one of Portland's bedroom communities, the city of Vancouver is now becoming its own urban destination.
A lot of people don't want to go across the bridge, so why you don't need to, everything's here. It's even better here, really. It's beautiful.
As Washington's fourth largest city grows,
as more people kind of like move into the area, it becomes a higher populous area, and you always kind of see like, there's more crime, there's more traffic.
So do the demands to tackle key issues, including public safety.
We still want people to feel safe and secure in their homes and their businesses on the street sidewalks of Vancouver.
Homelessness and affordable housing.
But people need options, and we don't have a lot of options right now.
We sit down with Vancouver's new city manager to discuss the state of the city, plans to foster more growth, and major projects ahead, right now on Straight Talk. Hello, and thanks so much for joining us here on Straight Talk. I'm Stephanie Domerat. Now this week, we are talking about our neighbors to the north of the Columbia River, Vancouver, Washington. We are joined by Vancouver's new city manager, Lon Placon. Now before coming to Vancouver, Lon served as the city manager of Marion, Iowa. He first joined the city of Vancouver back in 2021, where he served as deputy city manager until stepping into the role of city manager just in October of last year. Lon, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for crossing the river and coming into Portland today. So first, how's it been going your first few months as city manager?
Pretty exciting. With a city the size of Vancouver, especially with projects like the IBR, we have a lot of interface with the federal government, and anytime there is a change in administration, it's always a challenge to keep up with shifting priorities. But we've been soldiering on. It's no secret that we had a tough budget year last year, so the organization's been adapting to that and really keeping an eye on where things are going to go over the next year in relation to the economy.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about the changes from the federal administration and potential funding changes that could impact Vancouver and people in Clark County. So we'll get to that soon. But I want to ask first, you came to the Pacific Northwest from the Midwest. What brought you here?
A combination of things, really. I mean, I characterize it as there were personal and professional reasons. One of the things that I was looking at is, as you noted, I was in the city of Marion. That's a city of about 45,000 people. And in Iowa, that's makes it the 13th largest city. And so opportunities to move up and stay in the state, go into a larger community are kind of few and far between. And some of those you look at and you think, oh, I don't want to work there. So the list gets even shorter. So the opportunity to be Vancouver's deputy city manager came up. I had a friend on this side of the river that forwarded it to me and who knew my predecessor, Eric Holmes, quite well and said, I really think you two would get along. And so that kind of launched me down to applying and eventually coming to Vancouver. On the personal side, I've been pretty open with the fact that I have kids that are parts of the LGBTQ community, and starting way back in 2017, started to notice legislation in Iowa that would have specifically targeted my kids and made them feel different and othered, and just would have been really tough on them. And so, I knew how that worked. That over time, it tends to be. First year it dies in committee, second year it comes out to committee and starts to get talked about, and then eventually some of those things, as we found out after we moved, did start to become law. Actually this last year the state attained the dubious distinction of being the first state to ever actually take something out of their civil rights law. They took gender identity protection out of their civil rights law, which would have specifically applied to my kids. What
has it been like for you here coming to the Pacific Northwest and landing in Vancouver in relation to that?
My kids feel, and the family have felt a lot more welcomed. We found a lot of support from people in the community and organizations in the community. There's healthcare options for them out here on a broader array than we had back there. So on balance, it's kind of sad to say, but almost with every succeeding year, the kids, because we moved them in high school, which is always tough, have just slowly come around to, well, yeah, we get it.
Why you came here, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about your priorities. You've been on the job for 6 months. So what are your big picture priorities going forward in this role?
Big picture priority, our top priority as an organization is addressing homelessness. Our most important project right now is getting the bridge shelter coming out of the ground, because that's going to be the next piece of really our continuum of care for addressing the homelessness issue. Outside of that, affordable housing and literally housing in general at all levels are crisis level for us. We really need to do everything we can as a community to support and foster the development of all sorts of housing options. Beyond that, working on the budget to see what we can do, utilizing the tools available to make sure that we have a sustainable budget going forward. There's some potential action in the state legislature that will make that easier, but won't necessarily address all the structural issues that we have. And then law enforcement is a very pressing issue for us. You know, we did Proposition 4 last year and it failed by a narrow margin, so we've been working with our partners in the county to talk about the whole kind of law justice delivery system and are looking at a potential Proposition 5 later this year.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about public safety and that proposition that did not get passed by voters and what that will mean. But let's talk about the growth we're seeing in Vancouver. Do you see the identity of the city of Vancouver changing from kind of a suburb of Portland, bedroom community, to its own urban destination?
Yeah, and that's not unusual. My community in Iowa was actually going through the same transition on a smaller scale, which was part of the appeal for me of Vancouver. It felt very familiar to me, and a lot of the projects that Vancouver was working on were similar to the ones that I was doing back there. Again, you know, there's just a difference between doing 4- and 5-story buildings and doing 18-story buildings, so differences of scale. But I think it's also a change, a societal change, and Vancouver has really tried to embrace that by providing more housing options, looking at more density, and really building the community around the idea of a 15 or a 20-minute neighborhood where people can access all the services that they need without necessarily having to get into a car.
So speaking of the relationship of Vancouver and its own area, you know, growing, I know that recently, of course, Portland changed its structure of government, local structure, 12 councillors, a city administrator, and a mayor. And that's kind of similar to Vancouver's structure. I heard you were consulted by the city of Portland on kind of how things went in Vancouver versus as they developed their new structure.
Yeah, we were trying to provide any support, answer any questions that they had. I had several visits with their staff during the course of that change and transition just to kind of explain how things worked in Vancouver, because in addition to, you know, my current position, I was a deputy city manager. Vancouver has 2 deputy city manager positions, so just kind of walking through this is the relationship between those, kind of the rationale between, say, how the departments that report to the new deputy city managers were split out, just to give them an example of a structure that's been in place for a long time and has worked pretty well.
How do you think it's going for them so far?
It's kind of a popcorn moment for me. I'm a prolific volunteer for the International City County Managers Association. I'm actually their past president. So anytime a community makes the transition over to city administrator or city manager, we want them to succeed. We watch very closely, and I've always helped the door open that if they need any support, have any questions, by all means call. We'll do whatever we can to help.
Okay. Well, in a recent Portland Metro report, we saw more higher income earners, so like households making over $100,000 moving out of Multnomah County. We actually saw an increase of those households moving into Clark County. What do you think was the reason for this?
I think if you look back to around 2020, 2021, Clark County entered into a little bit of a housing boom. Like in Vancouver's case, the waterfront was coming out of the ground. We were creating new housing options for people that didn't literally exist in the market before. Vancouver had single-family homes going up, and then you take a look at the smaller communities around us, Camas, Washougal, Ridgefield. They've all experienced similar housing growth. So I think in some ways it might have just been options. It's kind of speculation on my part, but I also wonder if the pivot towards remote work didn't help as well, just because of the taxation differences between the 2 states and giving people more options. You know, if you don't need to commute across the current bridge, most people would avoid that if they could.
Well, let's talk about, speaking of the growth that we're seeing in Vancouver, the City Council is currently considering options to annex its urban growth area, including areas like Hazeldale, Salmon Creek, and Orchard. So this would actually double the size of Vancouver. It would make it the 2nd largest city in the state. Can you talk more about why this is being considered and what it would mean for people who live in those areas? Yeah,
so Vancouver is a community that falls under the parameters of Washington's Urban Growth Act. And so we have to plan for future growth in a very intensive way. And the whole purpose of the urban growth area is that it will be part of a city someday. It's literally the only way that you can grow out in the county is to be part of an urban growth area. And so it's designed that way that eventually it will be part of a city. And Vancouver has been looking at that. We have utilities that extend out into those areas. In one of the fire districts, the employees of the rural fire district are actually our employees under a contract with that fire district. We work very cooperatively with the water and sewer providers out in that area. So it's always been something that's been contemplated, but I think as we look at the growth and development of Vancouver, we're kind of at this crossroads. As an example, we've had this big discussion about law and justice, and the area needs a significant increase in police services. We're geared to provide an urban service model, and you look at it and you look at the density of the people that are there and the call volume. Sheriff's departments are typically built around a rural services model, but one agency or the other needs to be staffed up to be able to cover the 160,000 people that live out there adequately.
Is there concern that adding these new areas would overstretch the city infrastructure on things like sidewalks, city lights, things like that?
That's actually part of the discussions that we need to have with the county. The purpose of talking with the city council about it was, do you want us to take this on as a project or not? It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It'll take, probably a couple of years worth of discussions, and then that will work out what an annexation could look like, how long it will take. But for example, under county development standards, if you do a subdivision, you may not be required to put in street lights for the street. And so it's a lot more expensive for us to come in after the fact and do it than it is to do it when the development actually occurs. We have different expectations around density, around transit options than the county does. And as that area grows and develops, most folks, honestly, a lot of them out there don't necessarily know they aren't part of Vancouver because they have Vancouver mailing addresses.
Okay, we'll see what happens with that. A lot more talks to come. Well, Vancouver's mayor gave her State of the City address this week, and one of the first things she addressed is that there was fear and uncertainty in the city around immigration-related executive orders out of the Trump administration. So can you talk more about what the city is seeing and hearing in this case?
Yeah, there was almost an immediate influx of questions and calls to the city around our intentions, our policies around immigration. But for us, it comes down to a couple of different factors. One of our city councilors is fond of saying that, communities don't have citizens, we have residents. And it's actually true. We don't issue passports. We do not issue driver's licenses. So from that standpoint, states and the nation have citizens. We have people who choose to live in our community. And there's a philosophy that if you live in our community, you deserve the same level of service regardless of your immigration status. And so all the way back in 2019, the city and police department adopted a policy that we just were not going to be a primary enforcer of immigration laws. That being said, if somebody does something, there's criminals out there of all stripes, and if somebody does something else, a criminal act, then we're going to expect to hold people accountable. But we're not pulling people over for the purposes of checking immigration status, anything like that. We've had a lot of meetings with community groups just to reassure them about that. We've met with a group of business owners to talk through what that necessarily means for them, help them understand what their rights are, how the system actually is supposed to work, and just provide support where we can.
Okay. Well, as we see President Trump's administration cutting federal funding, are there projects or programs that could be impacted in the city? For example, FEMA, we know, provides funds for some emergency personnel funding.
Yeah. So one very specific one that's going to have a direct impact on us is they just closed down a National Fire Academy. And for us, that's where we send all of our firefighters for hazmat training. And the federal government gives us grants to do the hazmat training. And even if we can say bring the instructors to Vancouver to do the training, they aren't going to have the facilities, they're not going to have the same type of tools that they would have had down at the National Fire Academy. So for us, one of the things that we're really watching, FEMA is also a good example. Some of these executive orders are directly affecting public safety, and I'm not sure that with the flurry of them that are coming out, people necessarily understand how broad and widespread it actually is.
For the Fire Academy you mentioned, what does that look like in real terms then is it for firefighters that work directly in the city, or who is impacted by that?
All of our firefighters are expected to have hazmat training because you never know when they go out on a call what type of things that they can encounter. And so they have to have a certain number of training hours every year, and especially for the incoming class, new hires, they have to be able to get that training so that they're safe when they're out there doing their jobs. And so we always look for the most cost-effective way to do that with the highest level of training, and one of our best tools to do it has now been shuttered.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We have a lot more to talk to after this. So Lon, thanks for being with us, but we will be right back after this quick break to dive into more topics impacting Vancouver's residents. Stay with us. And welcome back to Straight Talk. We are continuing our conversation with Vancouver City Manager Lon Pluckan. Thank you so much for being here again today. So before we went to break, we were talking about different potential impacts from some federal funding cuts. So let's talk about a big project, Vancouver, Portland, basically Oregon and Washington, the Interstate Bridge project. Now, a big portion of the funding for this is set to come from federal funding. Do we see any of those dollars in jeopardy right now?
Not at this point. The contracts for the 2 existing grants have already been signed, and I know that our legislative delegation out in Washington, D.C. has been in close contact with the Secretary of Transportation. And I think it's important to remember that the Interstate Bridge project has a multitude of different things that it will provide. It'll improve our transit options, but it also is really critical for freight for the entire region, the inland states that benefit from and bring commodities out through our ports. So this is a project of national significance for a lot of different reasons.
So you don't see any threat to funding right now when it comes to the bridge project federally?
We haven't seen anything come out of DC that indicates that it would be in jeopardy. I mean, and I think it's also important to remember that the early days in the development of this project started in Trump's first administration. These projects literally do not and cannot happen overnight. So it has a long history, literally bridging different federal administrations. Well,
currently in the bridge plans is also the light rail extension that would go into downtown Vancouver. The light rail has historically been unpopular in some parts of Clark County. So recently Camas and Battleground City Council voted to oppose it. What's your stance on this?
Well, I mean, they're taking action in relation to some of the very preliminary operating costs that we've been told might apply for doing the light rail. So they're asking a good question, which is, where do these numbers come from? Why are they so high? What's the level of service that we would need to expect? Where I think we've differed is, when Vancouver saw those numbers, we set up a meeting with TriMet to sit down and start to understand what's the operating model, what's driving these numbers. And some of the other communities just balked at it and were like, okay, if it's going to cost that much, then we don't necessarily want to support having that across there. There is definitely a faction in the county that just doesn't want light rail in particular. But some of the things I wonder about, they talk about citing public votes and things, but the plan that was actually voted on was a lot more expansive for the development and growth of light rail versus just literally bringing it across the bridge and terminating in downtown Vancouver by our library. So it's kind of like you can cite that, but that doesn't really apply to me because they were voting on a different project, and I don't know how that would play out today. Vancouver continues to be highly supportive of it just because, we're kind of the urban center. We have the highest concentration of people, and it will provide options for our folks as an extension of our commitment to climate action to take a transportation mode that isn't dependent on fossil fuels.
So given that the planned light rail really is only going to Vancouver, as you mentioned, though, do you feel like it's fair for other cities to pay for that or pay for part of it?
Well, it's a project of regional significance. That's like saying, should Washington not have to pay for part of the bridge? Whether there's a direct benefit to it or not, it is something that benefits them. It benefits their community, and I can pretty well guarantee that there will be folks from those communities that will come over and use the light rail. It may not be in the concentrations that you might see from Vancouver, but part of the discussion that we've been trying to advance is we just need to talk about different ways to pay for it. None of that has been settled yet. There are hundreds of different ways that this could be paid for, but some of the communities, unfortunately, have been walling themselves off from even wanting to have the discussion.
And with that, do you think the dispute and the kind of mixed opinions on this has any potential of derailing the project altogether or in any way, or the funding for it?
I hope not. There are other options, though. I mean, let's say one of the big pieces that we really don't know is that the final leg of funding for federal grants that we've been looking at would come through the federal transit administration, and we don't know yet what their priorities will be. If they have a different priority that doesn't include light rail, then say, for example, maybe we have to pivot to a rail-ready bridge and put the causeway and everything in, but not do the extension of light rail at this point. That's just a reality, whether folks want that or not. So we have alternatives out there that can continue to be explored.
Do you feel like the dispute over the light rail, though, would impact the overall bridge funding, given that it's kind of pushing plans back and moving things around?
I would sincerely hope not, because, for example, there's a couple of narratives out there. One is built around this idea of a third bridge. That's probably 3 times the cost of the one that we are building or contemplating building right now. And I've heard this idea tossed around that we just need to retrofit the existing bridge. There is no retrofit of that bridge. It is literally built on Douglas fir trees embedded into the Columbia River bed. And so it would be a reconstruction. And by the time you do that, you're already there on expense and costs, and it'll never be as cheap to put in the light rail as it is now. If we try to wait and do it 20 years from now, it will cost a lot more. We've already experienced that just in the difference between the anticipated costs from the predecessor to the IBR project that stopped in 2014.
There's a lot to talk about with the bridge, but we're going to move on just for time's sake. So a community poll actually showed that public safety is a priority for residents in Vancouver. While the population has grown, so has the demand for services, including police. Last year, the department reported a 30% increase in calls, an 87% increase in reported crimes since 2018. Last year, voters did reject that proposal we mentioned to raise taxes to fund more officers. What is next in that case, and where does the police response stand now?
So one of the messages that we heard from the voters last time was that they wanted us to have a broader discussion with our partners about how law and justice is delivered in Clark County. And we've been having those discussions, looking at feedback from the community about why they supported the Proposition 4 and why they opposed Proposition 4. So one example I can give you is we had a lot in there, and there were pieces of it that were proposed that we really didn't have, a defined plan around. One I'll just pick on is automated traffic enforcement. So I think, some of the questions we had around the automatic traffic enforcement were like, what kind of cameras would they be? Are these red light cameras, speeding cameras? Where would they be? And we really didn't have that defined. And so some of those really smaller pieces of the proposition could take an outsized weight in people's minds when they were considering how they would want to vote. We did take it as encouraging that it didn't fail by much. 1,500 voters going the other way would have made a big difference on it. So the message to me there was that the community still had a keen interest on it, as is supported by our community surveys, but we needed to retool it a bit and narrow it down, be a little bit more specific and very clear about what we wanted it to achieve.
We also heard from the mayor this week that the most important issue that residents want the local government to address is homelessness. Yep. You had the first winter shelters this year. How did that go? And what are the outstanding challenges with addressing homelessness in your community?
The winter shelters went really, really well. We had kind of a confluence of events this year that really pressed the need for it. We've always had a need for more winter shelter, but unfortunately some of the partners that we work with, one in particular on the eastern side of Vancouver, a church, had been damaged, so they couldn't run through the winter. So we had to stand up something to take their place. But it's surprising when you look at the operations of those, how many families were in those shelters. And one of the nice things about the way we were running them is that the families actually got to stay together. So it's not like, one parent goes to this shelter, another parent goes to another shelter, and then the kids end up, somewhere else. So it let us keep people together. We didn't have any security incidents at those. They operated really well. I think that people felt highly supported. Those will close down at the end of the month. And then, as we get into next fall, we'll have to reevaluate the ones that our partners have been able to bring back online and see if we need to continue the program.
What do you think is the biggest challenge today that the city faces in regards to homelessness and addressing this?
So we are spending a lot of time and effort in really addressing the symptoms of homelessness, which is the folks that are out there on the street, and then some of the associated issues that can rise up after that happens. The root cause of homelessness is housing expense and the lack of affordable housing, the lack of continuum of housing. So when I say that we have a housing crisis, we know that we should be building 25 2,500 housing units per year, and I think our highest year has been around 1,600 or 1,700. We should literally be building 500 to 600 affordable units a year, and we've only been able to achieve that a year or two. But as rents go up, people get forced out, and one of the conditions that we've observed in Vancouver is because we didn't have what I'd consider, the most expensive housing options, the upper tier options, people would move down market. And every time they move down market, you've kind of pushed the next tier of people economically down one more market, which ultimately meant that the people who had the least means got forced out onto the street.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you, Lon, for coming on the show today. There was so much to talk about, so thank you again for being here. And thank you so much for watching. You can join us next week on Straight Talk, where we speak with a former director of the National Park Service. We'll see you then.